Welcome to Chapter 12. We're going to talk about production and growth in the economy. So here's the kind of things we're going to be talking about. What are the facts about living standards and growth rates around the world? Remember, one of our principles from Chapter 1 is that every difference in living standards can be almost every difference in living standards can be explained by the productivity of the citizens in that country. And so we're going to ask, why does productivity matter for the living standards? What determines this productivity and its growth rate? How do we measure productivity? What exactly is productivity? I know we've talked a little bit about that productivity is how much each individual person makes in an economy, but we're going to need to actually figure out a way to measure that. And then how can we use public policy? And that's, in this class, public policy means governmental intervention or government, any sort of government policies aimed at increasing growth. How can they affect growth and then the living standards? All right, so first, before we do that, I want to show you a sequence of 3 really cool pictures that are in your textbook. But this kind of helps us put a picture on what this is GDP per capita kind of idea. So let's review a little bit. Remember, GDP is the total market value of all goods and services produced in a country within a year, right? So this is the amount of product. Remember, GDP is a measure of stuff, always. Even though it's in a dollar value, it's a measure of stuff produced in a country in a year. When we take that and we divide that by the population, right, we get this thing that's GDP per capita, or the GDP divided per person, okay? And remember, this number here is our single most useful statistic when we want to measure countries from country to country, okay? This number right here, all right? So let's see what exactly this looks like. Remember, GDP per capita is still a measure of stuff, right? And so let's see what this looks like. So here's a typical family that's earning right about the GDP per capita for their country. This is England, okay? This is in the United Kingdom. And what they did is this is a really cool picture. They just dragged all their stuff outside on the front yard. The photographer paid them to do this. And took a picture of the family, their house, all of their stuff, okay? So this is a high-income country. This is the United Kingdom. The GDP per capita there is about $36,000 per person, okay? And these are in US dollars, by the way. The child mortality rate is very low. So child mortality rate is the percentage of children who die before they reach 5 years old. Okay, it's really low. It's 0.5%. And then high school enrollment rate is very high, almost 100%, right? 98% of the people. And now you look at their life, this picture is a couple years old, but so some of the stuff might look dated, but it's pretty nice, right? We got washing machines and dryers and ovens, and I don't know, we got a little meal going on here with nice utensils, and we got bed and couches and a sailboat and a car, like all kinds of things, right? So this kind of gives you a visual perspective of what this is considered high income across the world, right? High income. Their GDP is about $36,000 per person. Now let's look at a middle income family. Let's look at a family in Mexico. So this is all their stuff, and this is kind of cool too. Look, see, they have plenty of stuff. They have some bicycles over here. They have some beds, right? They have a lot fewer stuff. They sure don't have a sailboat like the people in the United Kingdom have, right? But they still have it. The guy's sitting with the TV right here, and he's and this looks like what a middle income GDP looks like, right? And so the GDP per capita of Mexico is about 15,000 US dollars per year, all right? So you see it's less than half of what they had in England, and you see the amount of possessions is about less than half, right? This really helps kind of solidify in our brain that GDP is a measure of stuff, right? It's a measure of products more than anything. Now the child mortality rate is a little bit higher, right? 1.6% of children die before they reach 5 years old, and the high school enrollment rate is a little bit lower. Okay, so you see, while perhaps we might think, oh, GDP per capita is not there's so many other things that I really care about versus how much money a household makes. Like there's so many other correlates to happiness that don't have anything to do with money. That's true. However, it just so happens that GDP per capita tends to be associated very highly with higher GDP per capita means lower infant death rate and higher education, right? So even though we don't really maybe even care about the actual dollar value that people make, we care about, their happiness or their health or stuff like that. It just so happens that very often, right, that we can measure GDP per capita, and it tells us a lot about these other things that we technically actually care about. Now let's look at a really low income country, Mali. All right, this is in Africa. And whoa, look at the difference here, right? What do they have? Go ahead, come on in. No, it's all good. Okay, so this is an entire household's possessions, and the household is earning right at the average GDP per capita, right? And so look, this is really all they have is a couple of sticks and a couple of pots, right? There's vast differences in living standards between this country, this family, which is earning the median GDP, the mean GDP, sorry, versus England, right? And so you see, look at this number, $1,000 US a year per person, right? Is that on average what people in Mali make? Look at this, child mortality rate. This is almost 1 in 5 children die before they reach 5 years old, right? That's really high. And look how many of their students of the school-age kids go to high school. Really low, right? Less than 1 in 3. So you see that while GDP per capita does not tell you everything at all, right? Sometimes we don't even care about the money. We care about the happiness of the families in the countries. They happen to be associated or correlated with these other things we do care about, right? So there's kind of a way to think in terms of what does $1,000 per year really look like, right? That's what it looks like right there. That's their entire possessions dragged out on the top of their house. So it's kind of interesting. Helps us put sort of like a face or a picture to these numbers, right? We talk about these numbers all the time. I like these pictures. It kind of helps us start thinking about what we're doing. Okay, so basically this table tells you the exact same story that those pictures told you, just a little bit more boring way, right? There's a huge difference in GDP per capita. Look, you see these lists of countries? We've got United States coming in right here, about $50,000 per person per year, right? That's what GDP per capita means. China's down here about 9,200. Singapore, look at this, really, really high up here, 61,000. This is they call it one of the Asian tigers of growth. It started in about 1960, and it took off. Right? Japan's reasonably high, Spain's reasonably high. India is quite low in per capita terms, right? Remember I drew up here some time ago the difference between India's GDP and Switzerland's GDP? And India's GDP is really huge, right? But their population is even bigger. So their GDP per capita is actually quite low, right? And when you spread it out to other people. Okay, and then of course these sub-Saharan African countries typically are in the very bottom of GDP rankings. So there's big differences in GDP per capita, and I showed you kind of the pictures of what they mean, so you kind of get a feeling of what it means to live, on $50,000 versus $30,000 versus $1,000. And there's another fact about this, is that the GDP per capita numbers, they don't stay the same every year, right? Hopefully, they're growing every single year. And you see this is ranked in terms of the speed at which they're growing. Okay? You see China's actually got the highest growth rate over this 42-year period. Okay? That means that every year, this number here gets, on average, 7.5% bigger than it was the year before, right? And Singapore is actually quite high too, right? That's why this number got so big. It didn't ever used to be this big, right? This is all in the last 50 years that we've been seeing this kind of growth rate. And you see all the way down here, and unfortunately, countries in sub-Saharan Africa have very slow growth rates, and they're also starting from small numbers to begin with. So this is a double tragedy for sub-Saharan Africa. Just a quick note, remember about growth rates. When you go to calculate growth rates, if you know the difference from one year to the next, remember you just take the new value minus the old value over the old value and times it 100 to turn it into percents, and this will get you a growth rate. However, if you have something like this is a 42-year period, right? So I can't, it's going to take a really long time to calculate this for every single year, right? So there's a shortcut that development economists use, okay? You just look at the very last number in 2012, and you look at the very first number, 1970, and then you just take the natural log. You guys have heard of the natural log? You plug in your calculator. The natural log of, let's call this the last number, or newest, right? You subtract the natural log of the oldest. Come on in. You subtract the natural log of the oldest or first number, and you divide by the number of years. And this will get you the growth rate over time. Okay, that'll get you the growth rate over time. So if you just look at the GDP per capita in 2012 and you take the natural log of it, you subtract the natural log of the growth rate in 1970, and then you divide by the number of years, so 42 in this case, this will get you the approximate growth rate, and you won't have to do this formula for every single year. Okay, so this is approximation, but it's what most people use because it's way easier to calculate the average annual growth rate. Okay? Questions on that? All right, so we've been thinking a lot about GDP per capita. It's important to note that GDP per capita is kind of our best estimate or our best characteristic of how a country's doing. It also can change over time, right? So you guys noticed Singapore had a GDP around $61,000. This hasn't always been true, all right? In the 1950s, Singapore was actually a very poor country. They were actually not even their own country. They were part of Malaysia. Then they went ahead and broke free from Malaysia and declared their independence in 1960. They became this small little island state with very pro-trade policies, very strict policies for the rest of their economy. But it's been growing about 5% per year since then. And so now it's very, very high. So you see, even though 5% may not seem like a super large number, when it's 5%, 5%, 5% year after year after year, you see what happens is that you start with a low number and then it increases by 5%. But the next year it increases by 5%, but it's 5% of the new value, right? Which is more than before, right? So it actually, even though it's the number of growth is 5% every year, it's actually accelerating in the number of dollars of GDP that it's increasing, okay? Even though the growth percent looks constant, 5%, that means that the number of dollars that they're gaining is actually accelerating, okay? Because it's a 5% growth, but over a bigger number each time, okay? And so there's a couple of Asian countries that are known as Asian growth miracles or Asian tigers. South Korea is one of them, actually. South Korea was also a very poor country, and now it's one of the wealthiest countries, just like Singapore is. And so this is interesting, right? Rich countries can't take their status for granted because soon they could be overtaken by these high growth miracles, right? Right now, China is undergoing extremely high rates of growth. no country has had the high rates of growth that China has over the past 30, 40 years. And they started out really, really low, right? But now they're middle income, right? And who knows? In a couple other years, at rates of 9 and 10% of growth per year, they might start overtaking some of the higher income countries.
Do countries usually sustain that high of growth for a super long time now?
The question is, do countries maintain that super high rate of growth for a long time? The answer is no. That's very good. I'll show you a little bit in this chapter of what ends up happening and why that's not sustainable. Okay, so here's some questions that we need to ask, right? Why are some countries richer than others? We've kind of pointed to some ideas, right? Growth rates have a lot to do with why some countries are richer than others. But why do some countries grow quickly, i.e. Singapore, while others seem stuck in a poverty trap, i.e. the country of Chad, right? Or the country of Mali, right? This word right here, this phrase, poverty trap, is used by development economists. It's common. It's the unfortunate condition in which the poor countries just can't get started at growth, right? So they have maybe a low GDP of $1,000, but it's not increasing. It just stays at $1,000 US GDP for forever, right? Or for the time period in which we are, right? Okay. And historically, I'll tell you, if we go back like to, 800, 900 years ago, at the year 1000 AD, almost all countries had the same low level of GDP. All right, there's been some cool studies. One of them, I think, is Angus Madison did like a comparison of the GDPs over all of recorded history or something like that of each country, and it's very interesting. All countries, even ones that we consider rich now, right? They started out like this for a long time, and then some countries all of a sudden shot up, and some countries, have kept going, right?
How did that guy get that information in the past?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of it is maybe not exactly super accurate, but he kind of read through books from the time and tried to figure out how much what their living standard was during that time. Yeah, good question. I'm not really sure. You should Wikipedia that, figure it out. But yeah, so this right here time period is started in maybe the 1700s, right? So for most of human history, the GDP of each country has been very low and not super growth intensive, right? Until about the 1700s, started growing slightly. The 1800s, England was the first country to experience great amounts of economic growth with what's called the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, there was a manufacturing revolution in America as well. And then a lot of the Western European countries took off also. Okay, so we have some countries that have experienced this growth, some countries that don't, and we want to see, is there any governmental policies that we can, maybe put in effect, maybe that have been put in effect that help raise the growth rates? Because if we can raise growth rates, then that means in the long run, people will have high levels of GDP per capita, which means that they'll have high levels of living standards, right? Okay, so this idea of productivity is always very important. Right? A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. So what we're asking here is about productivity. Don't forget that in the circular flow model, all goods that are produced get bought by someone and become income for the country, right? So at the country level, every single good that's produced becomes income for somebody, right? So every good and service that's made helps someone's living standard, right? And so if we can increase the amount of goods and services made in the country, right, we can increase the level of living standards for the country as a whole. Right? And that's this idea of productivity. how are we going to measure productivity? Well, this is kind of simple. We'll just recall that Y is the level of real GDP. And this is both the measure of stuff made in the country. It's also the level of income in the country, right? Because everything that's made, every product that's made is sold, and it becomes income for somebody, right? So Y is the income. It's the amount of products made. We're going to call L right here the number of workers, and this is pretty simple. Productivity is going to be Y divided by L, right? So this is output per worker. Okay, so this is how much stuff is being made total in the economy divided by how many people are making it. So if I go Y over L, or Y divided by L, this number here is not really two numbers being divided. It becomes one number, and it's just how much stuff is the average worker making. Okay? How much stuff is the average worker making? And you want to know what? It just so happens that how much stuff the average worker is making is exactly equal to how much income the average laborer is getting, the average worker is getting, right? The amount of stuff the average worker is making is exactly equal to the amount of income the average worker is getting. Okay? So you'll see that this plays a really important role. Knowing the level of output per worker plays a really important role in knowing the level of GDP per person, right? Okay, so why is this so important? Well, this is self-explanatory. When everybody's very productive, meaning that the Y over L is high, that every single person is making a lot of goods, right? If every worker is making a lot of goods, then real GDP for the whole entire country is really big, and then incomes are high, okay? And so if I can just get Y over L to grow, then my incomes will grow, right? So if I can get each worker to be more productive in 2011, in 2012, 2013, have them make more goods and services, right, each year, then living standards will go up. So let's ask, how do we do that? What on earth changes productivity and the growth rate of productivity? Okay? So the first thing that I want you to think about to answer this question, right? What makes a worker, more productive or able to make more stuff? The amount of physical capital that he has access to, right? And this is called, well, it's called physical capital. I have physical in brackets here because most of the time we just say capital, right? But there are other types of capital coming in the other slides. But I want you to know the difference. We'll call the other types of capital their full names, but most of the time we just say capital. Okay? But we're talking about physical capital. We're talking about tractors. We're talking about factories. We're talking about shovels to dig stuff with. We're talking about computers for people to type on. Okay? These are inputs to their productivity, right? Okay. And we use the capital letter K to stand for capital. Why didn't we use C? It's already used for consumption. Yeah, exactly. It's already used for consumption. Okay, so we have to use K for capital. And so we are talking about the level. Big K is the total level of structures or investment in the entire country. If I'm caring about per worker, I just divide it by the number of workers, right? So this right here is the total amount of capital in the country divided by the number of workers. This number here gives you the amount of capital per worker, or the amount of capital that your average worker has access to. So this is clearly a very important determinant of Y over L, right? We're trying to figure out what makes Y over L change, right? What makes my output per person change? Well, clearly, if I give my worker access to more capital, more K over L, it's going to make him more or her more productive, right? Imagine my economy is a bunch of guys who dig holes for, I don't know, burying internet cable underneath the ground. If I make them use their hands, how productive are they going to be? Not super, right? If I give them maybe a little bit of K over L, right? So maybe they each have a shovel now, they'll be more productive, right? But what if I give them each a tractor, right? And so their K over L is going to be huge. Their output is also going to be very huge, right? So this is a very important part of increasing productivity. Why do we want to increase productivity? Because Y over L is the biggest determinant in GDP per capita, right? When this goes up, people's living standards go up, okay? And so if I can increase this, then that makes this go up, then that makes people's living standards go up, all right? So I'm really interested in increasing productivity due to this. The average worker has more capital, productivity is increased, okay? And so there's an easy way to put it, right? When K up over L goes up, Y per worker goes up, right? So let's call this capital per worker and output per worker. Okay, and now there's another type of capital we're going to talk about, and this one we don't call just plain old capital. This one we call human capital, and we'll give it the letter H, okay? And so it's the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. School, right? School is an example of human capital. If I have a bunch of workers in my factory and I allow them to get more education, even if nothing else changes, they're going to be more productive, right? It can be through on-the-job training. It can be through life experiences. We call this human capital, okay? And H is the total level of human capital in the economy. This is very hard to measure, actually, and it's kind of more of just an abstract idea. And H over L is the average worker's human capital, right? So this is the human capital per laborer, or H over L, okay? So when the average worker has more education, more skills, etc., productivity is, in fact, higher. Okay? So an increase in human capital per worker, causes an increase in output per worker. Okay? And then another thing that can influence output per worker, right? Think about it. What could make the employees in this factory even more productive? If they're given more natural resources to use, okay? So natural resources, and we'll call that N. It's the inputs into production that nature provides, right? So natural inputs. Maybe coal, maybe oil, maybe wood, maybe arable land to farm on, okay? So if you keep everything else equal, if you have more natural resources, your country's GDP is going to be higher, okay? That's one of the reasons that economists think, right, that America became so strong is because we have a huge number of natural resources in abundant form here in America, right? More than perhaps in any other country. And so because we were able to have such a large amount of N, we were able to have Y grow for a large number of years. Okay? And so, of course, we're going to put this in per worker terms because we're investigating the output per worker. So we're going to call this natural resource per worker. And then if that goes up, that will increase GDP per worker.
Does that go up a lot? Only, I mean, we don't really get more.
No. So natural resources generally doesn't go up. There's some countries have abundant natural resources like Saudi Arabia. Some countries like Japan have to import natural resources. But for the most part, it's like how much the country started with. Okay. Yes.
So since we discovered like new oil from like fracking and stuff, would that make our N go up?
Yes. So new oil from fracking that people have discovered would make the N go up. Yes, it would. Good question. Okay. So this is much harder to control than the others, right? It's easier to maybe provide more capital per laborer or more human capital per laborer. It's harder sometimes to control the amount of natural resources per laborer because that's just kind of what the country's stuck with, right? But it's still very important in terms of determining the level, like the starting level of where people's GDP is, okay? It's probably less of a determinant. This probably doesn't have as much to do with the growth rate of GDP over time as like where the level is started with. That's my personal opinion, that natural resources per worker doesn't change the growth rate quite as much. Okay, and then the last thing that has something to do with output per worker is this thing I'm going to call technological knowledge, okay? And so it's basically the understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. It doesn't actually have to do anything with what we consider technology, right? We think of technology as like computers or a smaller cell phone or faster internet or something like that. Really, it can just be, well, first of all, we denote it with A, by the way. A is technological progress. T was already taken for time and a couple of other things, actually. But it means any advance in knowledge that boosts productivity. So this is kind of like the catch-all term, right? When we see that productivity, Y over L, goes up and human capital per worker didn't go up and natural resources per worker didn't go up and physical capital per worker didn't go up, then we're like, oh, well, it must have been an increase in technology, right? Basically, it's our catch-all term for any time productivity per worker goes up, but none of these other things have changed, okay? And so a good example is Henry Ford and the assembly line. You know, Henry Ford early on created an assembly line, and so that could be an idea of technological progress. But then even he realized that, if I put the guys who screw the door handles on before I put the guys who screw the doors on the car on, right, on the assembly line, then we're going to have lower productivity, right? So really all he did was switch the location of a couple guys on the assembly line, and he made all of the workers more productive, right? So he had an increase in Y over L, but he didn't have an increase in capital per worker. He didn't have an increase in human capital per worker. He didn't have an increase in natural resources per worker. He just switched the guys around in a more efficient order, right? That is another example of what we call technological progress. It's kind of like our catch-all term for when productivity goes up, but none of the other determinants go up. Okay? So that's our summary of the four main drivers or determinants of productivity. Do a little more explaining on technical knowledge versus human capital because they can maybe kind of seem similar, but technical knowledge refers to society as a whole's understanding of how to produce goods and services better, right? So when Henry Ford reshuffled around his manufacturing line, like that's something that now society knows, and all other firms that make cars can use that idea, right? So that's technological knowledge. Human capital is something that each individual person has, like knowledge that they've learned that can't just be copied because it has to be learned by individual people, all right? So that's the difference between human capital and technological knowledge, okay? So it is a little bit, they're quite different, but both are very important for productivity. Okay, so now we're going to put this all together in this thing called a production function. So it is I can either draw it as a graph or I can write it as an equation that basically just shows the relation between the output and the inputs. And it might look kind of confusing at first, but trust me, it's not that confusing. Well, I'll try to make it not that confusing. If you have questions, make sure you put your hand up and let me know. All right, so here's the general form of the equation that we're going to use. Y, let's remember what Y is. Total GDP of a country is equal to A, what's A? Remember the level of technology, times this thing, f of L, K, H, and N. So when I put f of blank, that just means it's a function that shows how inputs are combined to produce the output. Okay? Okay. So I'm sure you guys probably remember from math class, right, when you see something like this, like f of x equals 3x, for example, right? And this is just means there's a function, x is the input. What is the actual function? Well, it's 3 times the input. And then you'll get some, some output, whatever it is that you put in, right? So you can put, the number 4 in here for the input, which means you put 4 in there, which means you get some output of 12 over here, right? So this is the same, this is the way we represent functions in math, and this is the exact same thing we're doing here. We're just calling, well, let me give you another example before I finish. Perhaps you've seen this, which means it's a function, and x is an input and y is an input, and then you'll have something here, maybe 3x plus 4y, okay? So it's, again, you're just having, this says there's a function, that's what the f means. X and y are the inputs. You put them in here, and then, you'll spit out some output right there, okay? In the same exact way, we're going to write this. There's some function, right? And this is how much output people make, right? How much GDP that people make. And what are the inputs? Well, I know the inputs are, I need people, right? And I need capital, and I need human capital, and I need natural resources. But in this very complicated function, because this is an entire country, right? Am I able to just say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and write out the function? No, right? This is too difficult to go ahead and write it out. Maybe it's as simple as, the amount of laborers plus the amount of capital plus the amount of human capital, something like that, plus the amount of natural resources. Maybe it's that simple. But in all likelihood, we have no idea about what the actual function looks like, okay? Because it's the entire country, right? Really, the best we can do is look at the United States as like a big factory, some smoke coming out the top, right? And we see on one side that there's laborers going into work, and there's some capital that goes in, and there's human capital, and there's natural resources as inputs, right? And it spits out an output, and what do we call that output? Y. Okay? We can't really look inside the factory if the factory is the United States. Why? Just because it's too big, there's too many moving parts, right? And so the way to think about this is that this right here is just our production function. We don't know a lot about the actual way it looks, so when we go to talk about it, we just leave it in the general form like this, okay? So this just kind of stands for some function. Basically what it means is it stands for a function that I don't really know what it is, but I know a little bit about it, but I don't really know what it is. So I'm going to leave it like this, okay? That's what that means. It's kind of like a black box. We can't look inside of there. We just see that these inputs come in and an output comes out, and I know something's going on in there. I know there's some sort of function going on in there, but I'm not exactly sure what it is, okay? This actually drives some people crazy about macroeconomics, this fact. If it drives you crazy, I kind of sympathize with you because it does seem a little ridiculous, but it's kind of the nature of the beast. It's just too big of a problem to really kind of analyze. And some economists have done way more specific work trying to put exact functional forms on this. Well, do these things add together? Do they multiply together? Maybe it's L to the something power and K to the something power. I don't know, right? And they've arrived at pretty good estimators, but it changes all the time too, right? So we're just, for the purposes of this class, going to leave it like this. And basically your idea here is thinking that this is just some sort of a function, some sort of factory that spits stuff out. Now, you notice here that there's actually something being multiplied times this function, right? The A. So we actually are going, I'll put it on this side, to multiply by some A. What is that A? Who remembers? Technology. right? So, and what is that technology? It's just any sort of way to change the manufacturing process of the goods and services so we can get more out of them, okay? So imagine, here's what's happening. Here's how we measure A, right? We notice that L is the same, K is the same, H is the same, N is the same, but then all of a sudden the next day, they make twice as much Y. So what do we think? Well, they must have done some upgrades inside this factory somehow. We don't know what, but they must have done some sort of upgrades. This right here must have doubled and gone up. And we would call that technological progress. Okay? So that's the way to approach this production function. At the beginning, it looks pretty scary, but it's very, really, very simple. It's broken up into two easy parts. This guy is like, Y went up, and I didn't see any of this stuff change, so I'm going to call it A, right? Technological progress. And this stuff is just all the stuff that we see entering the factory every day, and this function tells us that it just spits out, and then we get some sort of a GDP. Okay? And so that's why the A is on the outside, and all the LK, the H, and N are on the inside, because these things go into the factory, and the A is just some sort of, I don't know, technological progress that I'm not exactly sure what happened. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? How to think about this? All right. So I told you that we don't know a lot about what the function actually looks like, but we do know one thing about it, and it's that it has the property that constant returns to scale. Right? We also call this CRS. Basically, what this means is the following. If I change all the inputs by the same percentage, it will cause the output to change by that same percentage. Okay? If I decide to double all the inputs, I'm going to double my output. That's what it means constant returns to scale, right? So if I scale up, if I introduce twice as many workers, twice as much capital, twice as much human capital, twice as much natural resources, I will get twice as much output. Notice I didn't have to change my A, right? Because all I'm doing basically is I'm creating an exact second factory is what I'm doing, right? I am just putting a whole nother factory right here, and it's got it's got L, K, H, N coming in here. And then the total output is just going to be 2Y, right? I just doubled labor, I doubled capital, I doubled human capital, and I doubled natural resources, and I went in two factories, and out came twice as much as before. That's what that's telling me right here. I didn't have to change the level of technology because it's the same exact level of technology. No technology changed. So the question is, since we don't know what this looks like, how do we know that if we just put a 2 in there that this doesn't go up by a lot? If this is 2 to the actually the third power or something like that, how do we know that doesn't go up a lot bigger? The answer is we can observe these and we can observe these, and we see that this happens historically. The other thing is that since we don't know exactly what's going on here, it's possible maybe this goes up to the third power, but this doesn't go up to the third power, and so it ends up canceling each other out, and then we still just get a double, right? But the reason why this has to make sense is because of this picture I just drew to you. If I know that one factory produces Y worth of goods, whatever dollar that is, if I just build the exact same factory next to it, by definition, I have to, and it's identical, right? It's the exact same, and so all I've done is doubled both of my inputs. By definition, I have to only have twice as much output as I had before, right? Because nothing else is changing, right? So this is more than just like a mathematical necessity. This is just like economic intuition here, right? If I know that exactly this gets me Y, then I know that exactly doubling it will get me 2Y, and it can't get me anything else, okay? Now, and that's even without trying to figure out what the actual functional form looks like, okay? In the same way, if I were to multiply all the inputs by 10%, right? If I increase all inputs by 10% more, that's the same as multiplying something by 1.1, then I have 1.1 times the amount of labor, 1.1 times the amount of capital, 1.1 times the amount of human capital, 1.1 times the amount of natural resources. I get 1.1 times the amount of output. Right? So I don't have to double it. I can do anything. Any number that multiplies it. Okay, it's called constant returns to scale. And this is actually a property of any function that's described mathematically. You can say it's constant returns to scale. That earlier function that I have, f of x equals 3x, this has constant returns to scale, right? If I put in the number 2 in here, then I get 6 out of here, right? If I double this, I put in 4 in here, then I'm going to get 12. I'm going to get doubled out of here, right? It's got constant returns to scale, right? This one, though, let's do f of, I don't know, q equals 3q plus 1. This does not have constant returns to scale, right? Because if I double this number won't necessarily double because the 1 doesn't double, right? Okay. So just kind of an idea of what constant return scales looks like in a mathematical formula. It looks like that. Okay. All right, any questions about constant returns to scale? Why is this so important? One, well, because it makes sense, right? If I double my amount of factories I have in my country, then I should double the amount of output. But also because it allows us to do something tricky here. It allows us to multiply. Remember we were just multiplying by like times 2 or times 3 before? Now I want to multiply it by 1 over L, right? And what's 1 over L? This is 1 divided by the amount of workers. Why do I want to do that? Because really what I'm interested in is not just capital. I'm interested in capital per worker, right? So if I multiply each of these things by 1 over L, I get something that looks like this. Okay? I have multiplied each of these by 1 over L. Now don't look at this side quite yet. Just write down what we've got here, right? I multiply each of my inputs by 1 over L. Okay, so I've taken this property of this production function that's constant returns to scale. It means that I can multiply these numbers by the same number, and whatever that number is, if I double them all, I'll double this or something like that. Well, I've done something tricky, and I've divided them all by L, or I've multiplied them by 1 over L, right? So I still have this constant returns to scale thing. Why did I do that? Well, because I'm interested in the level of capital per laborer, right? Because I think that has something to do with the output per laborer, right? And the human capital per laborer and the natural resources per laborer. Now, when a function has constant returns to scale, and I multiply all of the inputs by 1 over L, what does that mean that I'm going to do to the output?
Divide it by L.
Exactly. Divide it by L also. So it means the output I'm going to get here is y over L. Well, bingo, this is exactly what I'm trying to measure, productivity per worker, right? So it just so happens that if I divide each of these inputs by L, or multiply by 1 over L, then I'm going to get this idea here of productivity per worker. I want to point out that L over L becomes what? 1. So I go ahead and replace that with a 1. Okay? Sometimes this is written as little y. Okay, so I got the little curvy thing going on to show you it's a little lowercase y, which means big Y divided by the number of people is the amount of production that each person makes. Okay? Equals A times little f. Why little f? Because this is just the amount of production that one guy makes now, right? Little f of this is 1. It's not here. This is little k, right? I'm going to draw it in cursive so you can tell it's little k. If I draw a regular little k, it's too hard to tell, right? Little h and little n. Sometimes it's written like this. And it's the exact same thing, right? Let's reason through what this is. The amount of output that each my worker makes is equal to the technology times some individual production function for the amount of capital he has or she has, the amount of human resources he or she has, and this is the amount of natural resources that he has or she has. Okay? And this makes sense, right? If I give each individual worker in the whole entire country a little bit more capital, a little bit more little k, then they'll be able to make more stuff, right? That makes sense? So here you go. The productivity per worker depends on these four things. If I want to make people's life better, then I have to raise their productivity. If I want to raise their productivity, their Y over L, I have to focus on one of these four spots. Okay, either the overall level of technology in the entire country, physical capital per worker, I have to give them more shovels. Human capital per worker, I have to give them more training. Natural resources per worker, I have to give them more natural resources. Okay, I have to focus on one of those four ways to raise Y over L, that is productivity per worker. Okay, let's, I'm going to put this discussion question up there, and then we'll take maybe like a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and answer it. Okay, I'm going to read it off, and then you guys can think about it while you're taking a break, okay? So we want to raise Y over L. Why do we want to raise Y over L? Because we want people to have better living standards, right? So here's some options. Which ones should we do? Should we offer tax incentives for investments by local firms? Or should we offer tax incentives for investment by foreign firms? Should we give cash payments for good school attendance? Should we crack down on government corruption? Should we restrict imports to protect domestic industries? Should we allow free trade? These are kind of opposites, right? Should we give away free condoms? Should we do which of these? Right? Right? Okay, so take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at... Okay, how many people vote for A? One person voting for A, all right. How many people voting for B? 1, 2, okay, you can only vote once. I guess I should say that. All right. Actually, you can have, let's redo this. You can have 2 votes, because I can understand you wanting to choose 2 of them. Okay, you can choose 2. All right. Okay, A. Just one person. All right. How about B? 1. And now you're not voting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, your hands are kind of a little low here. Queen, are you voting? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we got. Okay, what about C? 1, 2, 3. Okay. What about D? 1, 2. What about E? You guys are good. What about F? 1, 2, 3. What about G? My boy's up in the front. You would. Okay. Just an idea that all of these have been tried by some country at some point in time in the last 10 years for means of increasing Y over L. And so, can somebody tell me who voted for A? Why A? So generally, these tax incentives for investment by local firms only kick in if you buy like actual machinery, right? So generally, these take the form of I'm a company. If I go ahead and buy another machine in my factory, I get to deduct that from my taxes, right? So if I invest in my employees' education, or if I even invest in planting a bunch of new trees, I don't get the tax credit. So we're thinking almost just physical capital for these tax incentives for investment. Okay, so all right, your idea is they can increase in investment. Investment will increase big K, which will make K over L go up, which we know makes Y over L go up, right? I erased it. I should not have. Let's write this out. Y over L is equal to A times F times K over L. I'm going to leave the 1 out because it's just 1. It doesn't change anything. H over L, N over L. Okay. So we know if K over L goes up, then Y over L goes up. Good. What about B? We have 4 people voting for B. Someone tell me why you voted for B. Well, in much the same way as if you offer incentives for investment by foreign firms, they'll pour money in and they will increase K over L, right? Now the question is, why local firms over foreign firms, or why foreign firms over local firms? My question would be, why even make a difference, right? It doesn't matter who's investing in this capital, right? It doesn't matter. As long as the capital is here in the country to be able to be used, then Y over L can go up. Okay, we'll talk about it a little bit more in a couple slides. What about this one? Who voted for this one? Go ahead. Right, incentive to increase human capital. Right here, right? If I give cash payments to the parents of kids who stay in school, then the parents are like, hey, you better go to school. And then the kids end up getting higher H over L, right? And so they can go ahead and produce more Y over L. Good. Crackdown on government corruption. Any ideas? Who voted for that? We have 2 people voted for that. Not a bad one. Any ideas? All right, we'll leave that one for a couple minutes then. What about restrict imports to protect domestic industries? Nobody voted for that. Why did nobody vote for that? What did we learn? When you cut off trade, that makes everyone worse off, right? Because trade can make people better off, right? Remember, people were consuming off of their PPF. What about allow free trade? Good. We have 3 people who voted for allow free trade. And then give away condoms. Why? Lower mortality rates, perhaps. Perhaps. Okay. This has actually been used in the Philippines, actually. The Philippines give away free condoms to lower the population birth rate, actually, is kind of their idea. So we'll see in a couple slides that it's unclear what a high birth rate does to Y over L, because the thing is, if L goes up, right, if you have more population, then what happens to this number? It goes down, right? But Y goes up because there's more people making stuff, right? You might have technology go up because there's more people who are researching, right? So it's kind of unclear exactly what population growth does. I think most economists notice a correlation between as countries become wealthier and wealthier, they start having fewer and fewer children. Okay, it is just a correlation, though. It's not a causation. It's not known whether lowering your fertility rate actually changes the level of per capita production. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at all of these ways individually and talk about how they can affect long-run growth in productivity and long-run growth in living standards. Okay, so the first is this idea of savings and investment. And this corresponds to A and B, the tax incentives for the companies to buy machines and capital, physical capital, and invest in their companies. So we can boost productivity by increasing K, right? So if we increase K, we'll increase K over L, increase Y over L. This is good, except for these new machines aren't coming from nowhere. We have to invest money to purchase and build them. Where does that come from? We have to produce fewer consumption goods for right now, right? So in this year, I have to make less, iPhones or less pizzas or less something else, operas that I like to consume, right? Because I'm going to use that time and that effort and those resources, and I'm going to build some investment goods right now. Does that make sense? I'm going to build investment goods, and then in the future years, we can switch back to making the consumption goods that we like. So here's the key. If I want to increase K, I have to invest I can only invest if I save money, right? Savings, whatever I save, whatever, as our country we save, we don't consume this year, is available to be used to invest in new capital. And so this means that increasing saving now, I have to reduce consumption now. Okay? Even though perhaps in the future I'll be able to consume even more, sometimes it's hard to convince people to stop consuming a lot now and save for the future, right? Isn't that kind of what all college students are doing, right? You could be going out and getting a job and getting more money than you have right now, probably. But if you consume less right now and you save for the future, then you'll have this college education, and hopefully you'll have a higher paying job later, right? That's kind of the idea. So how do I get investment goods? Well, it comes from savings on the national level, right? Everything that people save can be used for investment goods. Okay? So there is this trade-off between current and future consumption, right? If I lower my current consumption a little bit, then I can invest, which is going to have better factories. That's going to make my future consumption go up. Okay? So there's trade-offs. Remember our I think it's our first principle of this class, right? There's trade-offs. There's always trade-offs whenever you make any decision, right? Okay. So next, let's think about what exactly happens when I invest more capital into the country, when I make K go up, okay? So next chapter, we'll talk a lot more about making policies that can raise saving and their investment, which makes K rise, which makes productivity will rise, which makes living standards will rise, right? So this is a good thing. We know that it is. The question was asked earlier, is this growth able to go forever? And so here's a way to answer this. The faster growth is temporary due to diminishing returns to capital, okay? As K rises, the extra output from an additional unit of K falls. I'll explain that in a second here. Okay, so I'll put this on a graph. Okay, so let's graph this production function. Remember that anytime you look at a graph, the first thing you do, don't look at the thing in the middle, look at the axes, right? And here I have output per worker on this axis, and I have capital per worker on this axis. Okay, and before I actually draw it, what do you predict is kind of going to be a general shape? What do you think? Is it at least going to be a positive sloping line or a negative sloping line? Positive, exactly, right? As capital per worker goes up, I know that this also has to go up. So I know the points have to somehow go like this, right? Because as I give the people more shovels, right, they can dig more holes, right? That's kind of the idea. It actually ends up looking like this. Now, why is that? And this is called diminishing returns, right? Diminishing marginal returns to capital. And so here's why. Let's say that we're down here, the workers are down here. How much capital do they have per person? Almost nothing, right? And so they can produce this much. This is the example of the guys digging with their hands, digging the holes with their hands, right? And so if I give them just a little bit of capital, let's say this is $10 in capital, right? And all of a sudden that's a shovel maybe. Look at how much their productivity explodes, right? Because they had nothing. Right? But now let's say that this is our workers in a rich country, right? And they already have a bunch of shovels, okay? And I give them the exact same $10 of capital, maybe to buy another shovel. What's the increase does that do to their productivity? Not as much, because they already have a bunch of capital, okay? So capital becomes less valuable as you have more of it, okay? Capital becomes less valuable as you have more of it. Down here, the slope of this line is very steep, meaning each additional unit of capital for the worker leads to tremendous increases in the output per worker. Up here, the slope is much closer to 0. For the same exact increase, you get a small increase. So to note that it's like this country up here or this worker up here is still producing a lot. It's still a well-off laborer, right? But the growth rate here is going to be very small. The growth rate here might be only like 0.5%, and the growth rate here might be 10%. Okay? So there's always those two pieces that you have to look at when you're thinking about output. You have to look at the level, or where do they start at, and then you actually have to look at what percentage they're changing or what percentage they're growing, right? Here we're starting low still, but we're growing fast. Here we're starting high, but we're growing slow. And each is with the same amount of capital. So there's this thing called the catch-up effect, or it's also many times known as convergence. And it's this idea right here. Let's say that poor countries are down here and rich countries are up here on capital per labor. That means that poor countries are going to grow faster than rich countries. Does that make sense? So let's say the poor country starts here, and the rich country starts there, okay? And then you give them both the exact same increase in K over L, all right? The poor country's growth is really big. The rich country's growth is really small. Even if they're both doing the same amount of saving, right? They're both doing the same amount of saving and investing into their economy. So you can't say like the rich country is not trying as hard because it got big and old, you know, something like that, right? It just has to do with the production function. For a given level of all the others, right, H over L, N over L, and A, K over L has this diminishing marginal returns. Okay, diminishing marginal returns. It never quite goes to 0, but it can come quite close to 0. I mean 0 growth, not 0 output. Okay, so the idea is convergence or catch-up effect. It gives the opportunity for the poor countries to kind of catch up to the rich countries, provided that they're able to even start growing, right? You have this idea called the poverty trap if the country is too poor to even start this growth, right? Because what does this growth mean? What I'm doing here is I'm increasing capital per worker, which means that at the end of every year, right, there has to be a little bit of money saved over that wasn't consumed to be able to purchase new capital goods for the economy, right? Well, what happens if the country is so starving they get to the end of the year and they didn't even have enough money to make it through the whole entire year, right? Is the next year, are they going to be able to grow in capital over labor? No, right? That's called the poverty trap. So a lot of international aid organizations have this kind of idea. If we just at least give them enough money to start with a little bit of increase in their K over L, then they're going to be able to grow a bunch, and then they won't need our money because they grew a bunch, so they'll have enough extra to go ahead and grow a little bit here. So that's kind of the idea of kickstarting growth. And a noted economist, his name is Jeffrey Sachs. He's very much committed to this. He is a very prominent economist, and he thinks really the entire sub-Saharan Africa people being super poor problem, it can be solved with just this giant, really quick infusion of cash real quick, just to get it started, right? Now, of course, the problem is that infusion of cash has to be used to what? To grow K over L, right? Or else it's going to be misused. If it goes into a corrupt government and then it just gets siphoned off into a bunch of corrupt government officials, then it won't grow K over L at all, right? So that's kind of the idea on growth. A real basic idea on how countries can grow. So here's an example. From 1960 to 1990, over this share of 30 years, United States and South Korea devoted a similar share of GDP to investment, meaning we had percentage-wise equal increases in K over L. So each country was devoting the same amount of money to increasing K over L, so you might expect it to have similar growth performance. But actually we know that Korea over this time grew over 6%, and it's actually pretty much almost as rich as the United States is now, and it started out way, way, way poor. And the United States only grew 2% per year, right? So why did this happen? Because Korea was at a lower place, right? At the lower end of the graph, and then the United States was up here on the higher end. Okay, so there's the idea. K over L, capital per worker, was far smaller in Korea than in the United States at the beginning. Okay. But then as Korea starts approaching the same level as the United States, it also starts slowing. So this kind of answers that question, saying generally the growth rate cannot be high forever, right? Once you get to a certain level of K over L, the curve starts getting flat and you stop growing quite as much. Okay, so some countries that want to invest in their K over L, their capital per worker, but don't have enough money for their own in their own countries. Remember, I was just talking about these countries at the end of the year, they run out of money, they're not able to invest. Should be open to investment from abroad, perhaps, right? So to raise capital per worker, and then which will raise productivity, the government can also encourage foreign firms to put money into the country. There's two broad classifications that foreign firms pour money into investment. The first is FDI, or foreign direct investment, and it just means that a foreign company builds a factory in your country. They're directly investing in your infrastructure, right? So when the foreign country comes and builds a company or a factory in your country, K over L goes up. Now the other way is just to use foreign money to build a factory in your country. That's called foreign portfolio investment. Generally what happens is, a foreign company buys stock or some sort of bonds or some sort of loans money to the company in exchange for some sort of an ownership share, and then the company builds its own factory in the foreign country with money from abroad. Okay?
So would the company Alibaba,
Alibaba, yeah.
Would that be an example of foreign portfolio investment from Americans or American shareholders in China?
Yeah. Yes. The Alibaba IPO is exactly foreign portfolio investment. So, actually, as was just brought up, the IPO of Alibaba, I don't know if you guys have heard of this, one of the biggest IPOs ever occurred, just was listed on the stock exchange and people were able to buy shares of it, is a Chinese company, kind of like a Chinese Amazon or something like that, right? So Americans bought billions of dollars of Alibaba stock, right, which is sending that cash over to China, which then Alibaba can go ahead and invest that into whatever it needs, whatever capital it needs. So we're going to make China's capital per worker go up, right, by foreign portfolio investment. So hopefully they'll be able to have an increase in their K over L, or Y over L. So the idea here is that, remember the difference between A and B back when we were doing the learning exercise. A was, should the government encourage tax incentives to encourage investment by local firms, and then B was foreign firms, right? So the question is, or I guess the idea I'll present to you guys is, should it really matter if they're local or foreign? Really all we need is an increase in the K over L here, right? Now it's true that some of the returns from foreign firms, when they are, some of the money and the increases in output go back to the country that provided the money, but plenty of them have to do with workers that have more access to more capital and are able to use more capital, and so therefore have higher productivity. Okay, so if the country doesn't have enough funds on its own, right, at the end of the time period to save some and reinvest some for investment, using foreign funds is better than doing nothing, for sure, right? While it's true that not all of the benefits will stay in this country, right, it's better than doing nothing. Okay. It's really hard because, for example, Apple builds these companies under the name Foxconn in China, and they build all these phones, right? They're pouring a ton of money into K over L, right, in China, and so they're having increases in Y over L in China, but of course, it can be really inhumane working conditions and things like that. It's a really, unfortunately, bumpy transition, right? We do have the fact that China, because of these factories, is probably got one of the highest, has the highest growth rate in Y over L over the last 30 years. And so it probably has a lot to do with these factories actually increasing output. So it is kind of a bumpy road, and there's good arguments, I think, to be had on either side, as long as we're aware of both. So, I mean, maybe. America had terrible working conditions. Like in the 1900s, we had these really rich people. I don't know if you guys, we called them the robber barons, like Rockefeller and all of these very rich families that were pretty much controlled the prices of everything in America. And yeah, it's like that plus one worse, because not only do you have all of the people in the country trying to take advantage of them, but now you have people from other countries trying to take, right? So you have robber barons not just from inside China, you have robber barons from America trying to take over, right? The people are trying to do the same thing. So it might be it's probably even worse. But then again, they have a faster growth rate than America ever had, even during that time. Yeah, much faster growth rate. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up this idea of investment from abroad. It's especially beneficial in really poor countries that at the end of the year or at the end of the time period don't have enough to save to invest, right? If you can't have enough to save, you can get money from abroad. The other thing that's very, very true is it helps these poor countries develop the technology or get for free, basically, the technology, right? There are workers in the Apple factories in China that are learning much more about the technology and are learning some human capital that they never would have been exposed to if they didn't have the foreign investment. Okay. So while it many times, unfortunately, ends up with the people in the receiving country being taken advantage of to some extent, the argument has to be asked, like, are they better off maybe than they would have been otherwise? Right. Okay, let's talk about education now. Let's move on to H over L. So how does H over L look? If you promote educational investment in human capital, we know Y over L goes up. So that's why we have public schools, right? That's why we have subsidized loans for college. In the U.S., it's been estimated, right? In the U.S., it's been estimated that each year of schooling raises a worker's wage by 10%, right? It's huge, right? So each year of schooling makes H over L goes up, means Y over L goes up. And remember, Y over L, whatever a person produces, they end up getting paid. Because at the national level, whatever we produce is our income. So at the individual level, on average, what a person produces is what they get paid, right? So if I can do something to increase their production, i.e. school, that's going to increase their wage, all right? This also has that present and future trade-off, though, right? If I want to go to school now, I have to stop my consumption right now, go to school, invest, but then I can restart my consumption in the future when it's higher, okay? There's a program known as Progresa in Mexico, actually, and it rewards parents of families whose children stay in school. Brazil has one of them too, actually. Ecuador, I think, has a program as well called the Bono Desarrollo Humano. And so there are many countries that have tried to overcome their low growth rates by paying parents to keep their children in school. All right, so some of you voted for that, right? Paying parents to keep children in school. That's really, really actually has been shown to be beneficial if you pay parents to keep their children in school in poor countries. All right. So let's think about health and nutrition. It's kind of like a side side idea to the education, to the H over L. If you spend money on healthcare, then your H over L will end up going up because, you're a healthier worker, you're more productive. So in countries where the people are not getting enough food, just giving workers more food actually makes productivity go up. Remember, we already talked about South Korea going up over this time period. The GDP went up off the charts. Well, you know what else went up? Caloric consumption, look, went up 44%. So sometimes the limit to people's productivity is they just don't have enough food to actually be productive, right? If all their food is going in and it's just barely keeping them alive, then they're not going to be very productive. Just simply giving them more food, right? That's a form of human capital, can help them increase their output. So this guy, Robert, he was a Nobel Prize winner. He estimates that 30% of Great Britain's growth during this time period was due to improved nutrition. 30% of their growth, right? That's a huge amount. Okay, so it's no small thing. And a lot of the poor countries are hitting along this bottom, no growth trap thing because they just don't even have enough food to eat.
Is that part of why USAID sends
USAID? Yeah, USAID sends all kinds of food shipments, overseas for that exact reason. Yeah. So here's this slide talks about the the corruption in the government, right? A lot of you guys voted for a non-corrupt government, and while it's true that markets are a good way to organize economic activity, we need the government to protect property rights, right? And the ability of people to keep owning things, right? For example, as a company, am not going to invest in new capital for my company and raise K over L if I'm afraid that someone's going to steal it, right? Or if I'm afraid that somebody is going to come and take it, or the government is going to say it's not mine or something like that. Okay? So in poor countries, the justice system doesn't work very well, right? Contracts aren't enforced. There's fraud and corruption. Firms must bribe government officials to get permits, to build new factories and things like that, so K over L can't increase, right? So a non-corrupt, fully operating government system is really important for growth. And as well, political instability, meaning where we have changeover on types of governments over and over again, it creates a lot of uncertainty over whether property rights will be protected in the future. So I don't really want to spend millions of dollars making a better factory unless I know that it's going to be protected, in the next 20, 30 years, so I can go ahead and use my factory, right? If the government gets toppled and then they steal everybody's private property, which does happen sometimes, then nobody's going to invest money, right? Even now, it's difficult to get foreign firms to do foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment in countries where they have corrupt officials and or uncertain political systems, because they're not idiots. They don't want to send their money in to waste it, right? So even now, it's hard to do that. And this is basically what I was saying, right? When people fear that their capital might be stolen by the criminals or stolen by the government, then people have less investment, lower living standards. The opposite is what we need. We need economic stability, efficiency, and healthy growth. Require law enforcement, effective courts, a stable constitution, and honest government officials. Okay, let's talk a little bit about free trade. Right? You can have your government focused on inward-oriented policies or outward-oriented policies. Right? Inward-oriented policies says we're not going to accept trade, and if trade comes in, we're going to charge high tariffs or high taxes on it, or we're going to eliminate restrictions on trade, and we're going to promote integration with the world economy. Obviously, this helps foreign goods and foreign talent and foreign funds flow into your country, all of which can have beneficial effects. Okay, all of which can have beneficial effects. So basically the idea here is trade can make everyone better off. Here's another way that trade can make everybody better off. As countries are trading and as people are going from country to country, they bring with them technology and they can share the technology, right? So while we know that technology really is important in increasing output, it's really hard to develop this technology on your own. If you can get it for free from another country, you're much better off. Okay? So inward-oriented policies have failed to create growth for this problem many, many times. So Argentina during the 20th century, Japan even during the beginning of the 1900s was a very closed country. China was closed for many, many years. Not a whole lot of growth. However, outward-oriented policies have often succeeded. Singapore's a really good example, right? From 1960 to 2000, they grew by, about 6% a year. And they were extremely open with trade. Taiwan, there you go, South Korea, all of the Asian tigers. So research and development, this is how we get aid increase if I don't have trade with other countries, or if I can't borrow it from another country. I have to think of new ways of technology on my own. And so this is actually really, really, really important. Over the long run, right? In the long run, if you keep increasing any of these, remember they all have that diminishing marginal returns problem, right? So if you keep increasing all of these, eventually the growth of this will slow. What's the only thing that we can keep increasing that will keep having the same increase in the growth rate? Is this A, the technology, right? So we need to keep increasing technological progress over the long run. It's because knowledge is a public good. Ideas can be shared freely. And so once one person discovers some new idea or product or something like that, then they can be shared. All right? So the productivity of everybody goes up. So this is the only way to achieve long-run increases in growth. Okay? Not increases in capital, not increases in human capital, not increases in natural resources, but increases in technology. And it's really estimated in countries like the United States that our growth right now comes from only this, the increase in technological progress, right? And not increases in anything else, right? Poorer countries grow because this stuff increases. High-income countries grow because this increases. Okay? So how do you promote A? How do you get more A? You can have patent laws, right, which allow companies, they say, hey, if you invent a new product, we'll let you sell it like a monopolist for like a certain number of years, 15 or 17 years, right? There's tax incentives, basically. If you spend $1 on building a research laboratory, you won't have to pay taxes on it, right? So the government has a really important role in subsidizing or encouraging technological progress, research and development, because it will increase productivity in the long run, okay? And then also, this is very common in America especially, grants for research at universities, right? We have the National Science Foundation, we have the Endowment for the Arts, we have all kinds of public funds that are available to universities for research. All right, let's think now about population growth, because while this is not strictly a determinant of any of the production function, look, everything actually depends on how this L number changes, right? If population goes up, that means more workers, there's more people. That means, in general, it looks like most of these things are going down because L is in the bottom, right? So there's 3 different ways that population growth, or maybe more, but at least 3 different ways I can think of that it can affect living standards. So the first is stretching natural resources, right? So when natural resources, this number is generally a fixed number, right? As I have more laborers, more workers, this input starts to go down. Each person has a smaller share of natural resources, right? There was actually a philosopher named is Thomas Malthus 200 years ago. He said basically that soon we're going to run out of room on the earth. We're going to eat ourselves out of our home, and we're not going to be able to survive anymore. His prediction was not entirely true, but he has kind of maybe perhaps a decent idea, right? There's only so much natural resources on Earth, and then if we keep having more population, we're going to run out of the natural resources. But for a multitude of reasons, this has not seemed to play a big enough role in making our living standards go down. Our living standards have actually gone up. And the reason why his prediction went wrong, it's because this technological progress. Yes, perhaps the level of natural resources per laborer is going down, but we have A that's increasing at a higher rate than this is going down to take care of it. Okay, so that's the first way. The second way, it'll dilute the capital stock, right? So for both human capital and physical capital, right? As the L goes up, these individual terms go down, right? So if I have a bigger population, right, I have more laborers, then I have less capital per person to work with, right? Because the total number of K in an economy can only be grown by saving, right? So if I have a big increase in the number of workers, my K over L goes down. So I'm going to have lower K over L, lower productivity, and therefore lower living standards, right? So any type of capital, right? Both of these two guys suffer from this problem because L is on the bottom. Anytime I have a fast population growth, I'm going to have, for example, in the educational world, I'll have more children and a strain on the educational system, and so H over L might be falling. Okay. And it is true that countries with fast population growth tend to have lower educational attainment. This is not causation. This could just be correlation, right? It could just be that poor countries have fast population growth and poor countries also have low educational attainment. But if you think of it in terms of our model here, you can kind of understand how perhaps that could go down, right? Many countries, like we were talking about, use policies to control population growth. I'm sure you're all familiar with China, right? You're only allowed to have one child. That seems a little draconian and absurd, right? And there's a lot of parents that want to have more than one child in China that are suffering under this. So, you know, it could be argued that, yeah, maybe this is making K over L and H over L and Y over L go up a little bit, but the people are so much worse off because they don't get to have the amount of kids they want, right? And so it doesn't end up helping out at all, or it hurts more than it helps, okay? Then, of course, there's contraception, education, and availability. I was telling you in the Philippines, they pass out free condoms to try to reduce the number of children. And then the other idea here is that as females become more educated, each baby costs more because you maybe have to drop out of school, or you have to drop out of work or stop working for a time or something like that. So as babies start costing more, people buy less of them, quote buy, right? People have less children, fewer children, and then that is one of the ways that we can make Y over L increase, okay? But, of course, when you have more population, you have more minds that can think, right? That can promote technological progress. So you might have more scientists, more inventors, more engineers. It might be true that people with bigger families maybe have more nurturing parents, right? Because they have to spend more of their time in the household, and so maybe their children grow up to be brighter, and there are more frequent discoveries, and there'll be faster technological progress. Economist Michael Kramer thinks that over the course of human history, growth rates increased as the world's population is increased, right? And so the idea here is that this is the opposite of from what most economists, I think, argue. Most economists argue that high population growth rates, so a lot of children, harms growth, right? So if you have a lot of children, it makes y over L go down. Some people disagree. Michael Kremer thinks that, and he points out actually that as the times of most highest growth rates in history, like since the 1750s or so, 1760s, that time, both the y over L has increased as well as the number of people has increased together. So the fact that the number of people increasing is bad for growth might not actually be true after all. So that's kind of the thing on population growth. The jury's still out on that. It's unclear. Oh, and also he noticed that more populated regions grew faster, like Western Europe and the Americas, grew faster than less populated regions like Sub-Saharan Africa over the course of human history. Now, it's not always true. And even now, today, we see India growing a huge amount. And India has very high levels of fertility, meaning very, very high number of children per family. Okay? Let's do a little review. Here, let's list the determinants of productivity. List the things that make y over L change. That's what that means, right? And then we'll just give it 3 examples of three policies that attempt to raise living standards. And you got to tell me what the policy is and what does it change. Does it change A, K over L, H over L, or N over L? Okay, so take like 2 minutes, and then we'll finish up shortly. Okay, what are the determinants of productivity? What makes y over L change? Technology. A. That's A, right? What's the other ones? Don't look here. Capital per worker, human capital per worker, natural resources per worker. Very good. Very good. Okay, and so, I just threw down some policies. If you guys want to raise your hand and volunteer any, you can. Anyone? Ideas? Yes? Tax incentives or in direct investment or tax incentives for investment or foreign direct investment in physical capital, right? Very good. I actually said something similar to that, right? Encourage savings and investment. Anything that's kind of encourage savings or investment. Here's another one. If you do the foreign direct investment, like you were saying, you can raise K over L. And how can we raise H over L? Maybe provide public education. That's a policy that the government can take, right? So the idea here is, man, increasing y over L seems like such a hard thing to do, and it's really true. But we should at least focus maybe on these areas here. And this is a hard one to change, right? N over L. So really focus maybe on 1, 2, and 4. Okay. Okay. Now, the question here that I want to bring up, we're going to talk about this last thing, natural resources. Are natural resources the limit? So some argue that population growth is depleting the Earth's non-renewable resources and will limit growth in living standards, right? We're going to run out of oil, we'll run out of coal, we'll run out of trees or forests or something like that. So yes, perhaps true, but often what happens is before we run out of something, we end up finding a technological workaround, right? So as we're starting to run out of oil, we develop hybrid cars, right? As we start running out of maybe coal, right? We have maybe better insulation in homes, so we have to use less for heating, right? So why does that happen? But as the resource becomes scarcer, meaning the supply runs out, remember the supply curve shifts backwards, raising the price, so then now it's too expensive, so everybody starts looking for some other good, and it ends up happening, and we call that technological progress. Okay, so generally that's what happens. before we run out of anything, the price just gets too expensive, and then people end up switching. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a reason why, like at my house, we have an AC on all the time, so now we notice they shut it off on us
Really?
to reserve energy? Yeah,
The AC?
they shut it off. They do it
The-
like maybe twice a week on us.
The power.
The power for our AC. Yeah.
I have no idea about that. I don't even know if that's legal.
They sent a letter to us though, saying that like we need to reserve so they shut our AC off.
And they can just turn your AC off without turning your other things off?
Yeah, they set something on that thing outside
Uh-huh.
to shut it off on us.
Wow. I never heard of that. I think you use it too much maybe or something. I don't know.
It's on all the time.
That's so funny. I've never heard about that.
Yesterday.
That's a bummer. It's hot, too.
So,
That's another, that's another way to get around, right, to conserve our natural resources, is shut off stuff for people. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's the first I've actually ever heard of that. Yeah.
we started it at our house maybe 6 months ago.
Huh. Very interesting. Very interesting. It's crazy. All right, so finally, in conclusion, right, in the long run, we know that living standards, how people are existing, are determined by their productivity, which we measure Y over L. Okay? And so if we have governmental policies that affect the determinants, these four things, the determinants of Y over L, it will affect the next generation's living standards, because it takes a little while to come through, right? So one of the big things that we can do, especially amongst poor countries that can grow quickly, is if we can somehow increase the level of K over L. Okay? And so then that's what we're going to talk about next chapter.